Cornwall, located in the far west of Great Britain on a peninsula tumbling into the vast Atlantic Ocean, bordered to the north and west by the Celtic Sea, to the south by the English Channel, and to the east by the River Tamar. Join me, Victoria Jenner, a historian at the University of Exeter, as I go on an adventure across the duchy. From Tintagel in the northeast to Poole in the far west, I will be investigating maritime churches and questioning how far religion and the sea have played a prominent role in cultural constructions of Cornwall through time. These episodes will explore churches in relation to their communities, will involve getting up close to their natural environment, and following in the ancient footsteps of pilgrims. Fishing, trade and shipbuilding has contributed to Cornwall's local distinctiveness and its sense of place. What's more, all these industries shared a hand in smuggling.
If we're talking about real smuggling, this is not like the romantic picture. These people were armed and dangerous, and the revenue people also were quite capable of using their weapons, and there were quite big confrontations and fights with people killed on both sides.
In this episode, I start by following in the footsteps of some post-war authors, in search of why working with the sea has inspired their writing. I then travel across maritime communities to discover how different churches operated in the legal and illegal acts undertaken to support the local economy. Cornwall has been a maritime trading region since the earliest times. Whole communities made their living from the sea, from modest pickings offered by the marine life in the estuaries and shallows to the thriving commercial fishing industry. By the 1400s, Cornwall had become a leading fish export region and had become remarkably sophisticated. The growth in maritime trade was also facilitated by developments in ship design. By the 1450s, Cornish ships were large and capable of shipping at least 150 tons, a result of the Great Invention, an era of great technological change in European shipbuilding. Cornish shipbuilders would borrow and copy design features to create the most versatile vessels, allowing them to travel as far as Newfoundland. By the 18th century, Cornwall was making its reputation in pilchard fishing. Between 1747 and 1756, an estimated 900 million pilchards were exported from the four main Cornish ports of Falmouth, Foy, Penzance and St Ives. Indeed, it is Cornwall's maritime trading history that has inspired countless artists and in turn has undeniably shaped modern perceptions of the duchy today. One writer in particular was William Sidney Graham, a Scottish poet who became a cliff dweller in Cornwall from the 1950s. Graham moved into a cottage upon Zena's cliffs and very much exploited the symbolic power of the sea in his prose.
Above the spires of the foxgloves and above the bracken tops with their young heads recognizing the wind, the armies of the empty blue press me further into Zena Hill.
Graham gained his sea legs by going out with the local fishermen in search for herring. This meant he was exposed to traditional seafaring vocabulary. He conveyed the chanting of togetherness and deep throaty sounds by evoking the honourary shipbuilding, a name for the syllables fishermen sounded as they dragged a boat across the shore.
Well, I would say that my family, we were, I've been in fishermen in my family for 3 or probably more, 4 generations. When I started fishing, there would be 20 or 30 old men down in the village. And there used to be seats around. And they would get there and sit on the seats, and they would be talking about fish in bygone days, big catches and bad weather. And as I got older, they wouldn't have much to do with you as a youngster, but when they could see that you was taking notice of maybe how to learn to spice a rope and that, and then some of them would come and have patience with you and teach you these things. So I was sort of coaxed in, I suppose, and learned many of the older things from what was happening in the village and other coves as well. And a bit of romance to it, I suppose. I started when I was 15, and I went aboard of a boat and fished from St Ives, crab fishing, lobster and crayfish in those days. And as I grew up, I knew that that's what I wanted to do, so I stayed in the industry and eventually had a partnership with my brother-in-law. We had a new boat built in the village here in Porthleven. First of all, most of the fishing was done just daytimes, and some nighttime fishing with pilchard driving, which is, I don't think, no longer done anywhere. In fact, I believe some of the terms used the other day, I was talking to some of the younger men, and they didn't know what squinches was. Well, squinches was what we used, little bits of twine to tie the nets together to stop it being a big gap between each net. And I was surprised that 1 or 2 of these familiar words, which I grew up with, they didn't know, because there's all new technology now, and the older men, the older skippers, would terms they would use like poor weather sometimes. Carry your hands light, come on, we can't be messing around now, we're in a gale. So we younger ones would get on with, and do as we was told. And I feel these days that perhaps that's not used so much now, these terms, but a few orders would be shouted and everything would happen and get done. If you've been a fisherman for many years, then there's no way that you're not going to experience bad weather at some time. And maybe a couple of times in my life, perhaps I did question whether we might not come back, but and obviously the industry is a hard industry to be in, and throughout my life of fisherman I have lost a few friends to the sea and other things as well. But normally going on is a good life, it's a hard life, and when you're at sea for a few days, or in this case we would do 5 or 6 days and nights away, we become a family on the boat, very much like we was at home. And so we would have fun and we would know how each other ticked. I loved going to sea, I loved catching fish, I loved to feel the fish on the line. I like to see a lobster, and I still do, that's my best thing. I got ill some time ago, and I said to my wife, do you know, I'm just missing going to sea and to take a lobster out of the pot, and just to look at that. And I'd look at them, I'd think, oh, God's creation, who else could make something like this with such powerful claws and that.
Porthleven Harbour was completed in the early 19th century and has since existed as a fishing and boat building port. There still remains a hardy core of seafaring men who fish in Mounts Bay, whether it is crabbing, longlining, drift fishing or trawling. But their home port is their fondest anchorage, and as you can see, they take great pride in their boats.
I trust in the boat builders, because you can imagine that living aboard of the boat all week, and let's face it, we see awful storms sometimes. But the faith you have in your vessel is second to none, and it becomes a part of you. And sometimes when you're in these storms, you actually feel that this is right. I'm supposed to be here. This is right for me, so much as the wind is whistling in the riggings and the sea is crashing aboard of the boats, with everything else going on, and maybe half a trip of fish down below all iced away, and yet you still need to get another couple of days in, but you can't work in this weather, so you're just dodging, and all the time you've got that faith that your boat's all right, and you know that them men have put that thought and their hearts into it, because they know what these boats got to go through.
Now we're ready to head for the Horn. Way, hey, roll and go. Our boots and our clothes visor all in pawn to be rollicking randy dandy o. Heave a pole and heave away. Way, hey, roll and go. The anchor's on board and the cable.
William Sidney Graham is one of those post-war writers who uses poetry to reimagine the relationships between humans and their natural environment in the sea, much like the Porthleven locals right behind me. By reviving traditional methods of sea travel, Graham was advocating a returning to nature, and at a time when the world had been violently damaged by 2 world wars.
Hey, roll and go, take your hands from your pockets and don't stick your thumbs to be rollicking randy dandy o. Heave a pole and heave away. Way, hey, roll.
The local church, St Bartholomew's, was built between 1839 and 1842 and overlooks Porthleven harbour, and was at one time dependent largely upon a successful pilchard season. So I'm here to see how far the church actually identifies with its sea fishing identity. And as soon as you walk in, you are greeted with the most beautiful rood screen, which is in the form of an anchor, which is both quite unusual but very appropriate to its sea fishing port. We also have this beautifully carved oak pew, which has these emblems of fishing and farming interests. Now, this is very unusual, but also extremely relevant to the local area, and we also find it on the pulpit also. As I walk around the graveyard outside, I come across fishermen, mariners and sailors who have all lost their lives to the sea. Fishing and mining were the foundations of the Cornish economy, and despite the tin mining industry and china clay extraction in the landscape, Cornwall was seen as a primitive region, untouched by modern changes. After the Second World War, neatly packaged holidays by the sea had become an expected and integral social ritual for the everyday person. But for renowned author Daphne Du Maurier, tourism had reached an agonising peak, which she declared in her book Vanishing Cornwall in 1967. Like many of Du Maurier's novels, The House on the Strand has a supernatural element, exploring the ability to mentally travel back in time and experience historical events at first hand. The narrator agrees to test a drug that transports him back to Cornwall in the 1300s and becomes absorbed in the lives of people he meets there, to the extent that 2 worlds he is living in start to merge together.
Vicky.
It's Dara, Gary. How are you? It is set in and around Kilmarth, near the village of Terradreth.
Du Maurier actually wrote in the late 1960s House on the Strand, the translation of Terradreth, its meaning. And the basic plot of this was a sort of like a drug-induced going back to the past. And as a result, you've got the key hero in the plot actually going back in time, but when he actually comes back into the present, clashing with the landscape of what it is now. And that's a key factor in the way in which that book is actually written. But the association is very much with the Rashleigh family, a very prominent family that actually owned a lot of land in this area, major landowners. And one thing that you do find, obviously, in many churches is the association with local landowners, the Rashleighs being no exception. Itself symbolises something really quite important. It's called House on the Sands. If you look around us, where are the sands? They're actually much further out.
Should we have a look at the landscape down there?
Yeah, might be useful to actually point out what we were saying about how language reflects the landscape in which it's located. As we walk down here, this was possibly the site of the old Tywardreath Priory, it's been argued. And if you look over in that direction, look at that field over there, going up in the distance, you see it from the other side as well. This is probably a banks as the river would come in. Now, a place like Tywardreath Priory in the 1300s was actually attacked by pirates coming in from beyond, obviously, our shores. But it was an immediate way of actually being attacked, because if you look at the situation in many respects, it's been argued that the only accessible way to actually get into Tywardreath in the past, certainly if you go back to the medieval period, was actually by sea. It was the sea that was the route. We tend to forget that the sea is an important means of communication and was to continue way down through the decades, through centuries, actually down to the present day.
The Cornish language, otherwise known as Cornwall, is the direct descendant of the ancient language spoken by the Celtic settlers who inhabited Cornwall and most of the British Isles long before the Roman conquest. Dolly Pentreath was a local fisherman's wife who died in 1777. It is said that she was the last person who conversed in ancient Cornish. I've run over to see her memorial in Paul's Church near Penzance, which was famously unveiled by Prince Louis Lucien Bonaparte, cousin of the French Emperor, in 1860. Prince Louis was a keen linguist, and he specialised in the initial mutations of the ancient Celtic languages. He was so impressed by the figure of Dolly that he even celebrated her life 100 years later. In the late 19th century, Cornish had died as a spoken community language, and it was Prince Louis who was part of a growing academic interest in the language at the time. One could argue the revival of the Cornish language by the significant figure, Henry Jenner, was the impetus for a new shift in elegizing Cernow's quintessential past in popular literature. I was still intrigued by Du Maurier's idyllic Cornwall, and so I decided to travel to the location that inspired her first novel, The Loving Spirit, which she wrote in 1929. She was inspired to write the book after discovering the wreck of the schooner called the Jane Slade in Pont Creek. After reading the letters and boatyard records of local shipbuilding family in the nearby village of Polruan, Du Maurier visited the Slade family graves at the local church of Lanteglos.
This particular gravestone is the gravestone of a notable shipbuilder in this area. Shipbuilding has a very long ancestry in this whole parish. Polruan was building ships in the medieval period, large ships, I mean very large ships that were used as warships in the early medieval period, so we're talking very big. Christopher Slade came from an inland village about 12 miles away, and he was apprenticed in the early 19th century to a shipbuilder here. And when he finished his apprenticeship in this very church, he was married to a local girl called Jane Simmons. Christopher subsequently set up his own shipbuilding yard, and Jane, as his wife, she ran the local pub. But they were immortalised. He carried on building ships, and there was one particularly famous ship that was launched in 1870, named after his wife, called the Jane Slade. And Daphne Du Maurier saw that very ship when it had been beached in the 1920s. And her very first novel, The Loving Spirit, is about the Slade family, essentially. So it's about several generations of a shipbuilding, seafaring family. The figurehead was given to Daphne Du Maurier when she'd written her book. And it was given to her by my grandfather. It was my grandfather who had helped her with some of her research, because my grandfather was married to Jane and Christopher's granddaughter. So these, in fact, are my great-great-grandparents and really my inspiration for becoming a maritime historian.
So Helen, can you tell me more about the shipbuilding skills and how they might actually apply to the architecture of the church?
Well, the church itself dates from early Norman. We've got a font in there which we know is early Norman. But inside there is a most beautiful wooden roof. Now, it's often said that those wooden roofs are like the upturned boat. But you can well imagine that within a parish where you had so many shipwrights and skilled carpenters, that they would have those skills to do a lot of the woodwork within a church like that. So although we can't absolutely prove that it was shipwrights who did that, certainly within a parish that has these roots all the way back to the medieval period in shipbuilding, there is no doubt that there would certainly be used and linked within a church that, particularly in the medieval period, would be so important to the local populace.
Interestingly, I have heard of a similar tale relating to another church. This church has been made to architecturally look like an upturned ship during King Henry VIII's reign. So I'm standing just beneath Pendennis Castle, which overlooks the Carrick Roads, and this is an important part of the Foul Estuary. In the 1540s, Pendennis Castle was the last in a line of castle forts built by King Henry VIII. Pendennis was constructed on part of the Arwenack estate belonging to the Killigrew family and matched St Maur's Castle on the opposite side of the river. At this time, Penrhyn was the main town in the district and was defended by a number of forts placed upon the Carrick Roads, the world's third largest natural harbour and the first or last port for transatlantic shipping. So the story goes that Admiral Spry sailed out of Falmouth Harbour one morning, and on his way out he actually bumped into the French fleet that were coming in to sack Penrhyn. Of course he won and scored the first great naval victory for Henry VIII. So quite naturally this uplifted and boosted the morale of local fishing communities, and at the same time made Henry quite popular. So to commemorate this extraordinary event, he decided to restore the roof of St Anthony's Church and make it appear like a naval ship, and it's actually just on the other side of the Roseland Peninsula. The Spry family were the sole contributors to the restoration of the church, occurring in the 19th century and overseen by Reverend Carleon. This included the rebuilding of the wooden roof, floor tiles and stained glass. A port since Tudor times, Falmouth had shipbuilding and was a planned town, although the name did not exist until Charles II decreed it in 1660.
Prior to the early 17th century, Penrhyn was actually the biggest settlement, and Falmouth didn't really establish itself until throughout the 17th century. It wasn't actually called Falmouth, it was known as Smithick until 1660. So here we are at Falmouth Harbour, and you can see some of the large boats that are here today. There's a naval vessel and a cruise ship. And Falmouth is one of the biggest natural harbours in the British Isles, so it can take this large shipping. It's called Falmouth, it's at the mouth of the River Foul, and it is the beginning of the Carrick Roads, which are the system of inlets, rivers and creeks that lead further inland into Cornwall.
I decided it would be an idea to experience Falmouth Harbour and the route up to the ancient town of Penrhyn for myself and from a boat. So I met up with Will Forbes, head of the Kayaking Society for the Falmouth and Exeter Student Union, and who is very familiar with the busy harbours located along the River Foul. Penrhyn in Cornish means the end of a point, clearly attesting to its secluded position lying at the northwest of Falmouth's port. As I kayak further down the river to reach Penrhyn Harbour, I notice landmarks that speak of the area's history. I pass by a monument that records 150 years of the packet ships and the 1903 dock extension.
The packet ships were established in 1688. The first packet ship was commissioned then, and the service ran for over 160 years, primarily to take mail to and from the British colonies, which were growing at this time. So this harbour would have been teeming with packet ships during the 18th century, and they would land at the old Custom House Quay or on Greenbank, and they would also be bringing in contraband goods as well. as government ships, they wouldn't be subject to the same customs searches and so on. So they were ideal for people making a lot of money. Packet ships functioned to carry mail to and from the growing British colonies at this time. And Falmouth also hosted international shipping from the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic. It imported tea, it imported tobacco. Another remnant of the packet ships was some of the gardens, the subtropical gardens we see established around Falmouth and within the local area, including as far down as Trangwainton Gardens. These contain plants from all over the world that the packet ships would bring back in. The packet ships were ideal to do this because they were so swift. And these have now become known as Empire Gardens, a way of kind of showing off this connection with the world. But again, we mustn't forget that this is actually a colonial endeavour, and perhaps this narrative needs bringing in when we talk about the packet ship trade in Falmouth.
But mostly I am intrigued by how prominent King Charles the Martyr Church in Falmouth and St Gluvius Church in Penryn stand out. From the 1870s onwards, small steamships carried day trippers from Falmouth to Church Cove on the Lizard, and it is a short walk from the Lizard's village green to St Wynwallow's church town. It is thought that the last Cornish sermon was preached here in 1678 by the Reverend Robinson, but there is more to this church's story. The unique geology of the Lizard Peninsula makes the coastline around Church Cove some of Cornwall's most beautiful and dramatic. The cliffs are full of watery caverns. This makes the Lizard a particularly good hotbed of smuggling in the 18th and 19th centuries. Locals say smugglers would keep a watch for the customs men by posting lookouts on the tower of St Wynwallow's Church. St Wynwallow's is the most southerly church in Britain, and its stocky tower would make it the perfect lookout post. Smuggling emerged from punitive taxation imposed by a succession of wars with Europe, and it was the south of Cornwall that particularly caused concern for authorities due to its proximity to the continent. Even by modern standards, the quantities of imported goods are extraordinary. It was not unheard of for a smuggling trip to bring in 3,000 gallons of spirits, and according to some contemporary estimates, 4 out of 5 of all tea drunk in England had not paid duty. What's more, whole communities connived in the trade and profited from it. If we look back at Penzance in the 1790s, ship owners consisted mainly of shopkeepers, merchants and artisans who were willing to invest in marine transportation, but they were not necessarily wealthy. For most of these investors, it was the opportunity to access the dense networks of European and coastal trading. So as communities began to purchase items more cheaply or increase profits when duties went unpaid, smuggling became a tolerated activity for many people. Normal people benefited from the illegal trade of smuggling, and it is clear it was an opportunity for those familiar with Cornwall's coastline. James and John Duncan were both brothers in this area, and they were described by the press as the most notorious smugglers. And they were both engaged in a wide range of activities, of which smuggling was just one element.
Well, even at the time when smuggling was at its height, the smuggler became an interesting sort of character to represent. And there are really two traditions, one of which is represented by the cartoonists, people like Rowlandson and Cruikshank, where you get these rather grotesque figures of smugglers, often female smugglers as well, with barrels in their bodices and so on. So it's almost like cartoon Mr. Punch type of stuff. But there's also, of course, it coincides with the late Romantic period in literature and in the arts. And there's a sort of picturesque tradition in painting that's coming up. And one thing that the picturesque painters do is to start to put in these romantic landscapes, particularly on the continent, brigands and Romanys and sort of thieves hiding in the forests and the hills. Now, we don't have anything quite so similar in England, but very quickly people began to also represent the smuggler and to some extent the pirate at the same time as a kind of romantic figure. They would never have been seen that way in the early 18th century, you know, it was just, they were not romantic popular heroes.
The romantic image of the smuggler fits in with the picturesque village of Cadgwith. Cadgwith has this timeless feel, as if the passing time has completely missed this beautiful fishing village. So this area of the Lizard has been primarily involved in the fishing of pilchards for centuries, but now primarily deals with crabs. On the path is St Mary's Church, a tiny metal building erected in 1895 as a chapel of St Ruman's Church in Ruan Minor. So apparently there's a memorial inside to 2 fishermen who died in 1994, so I'm just trying to see it. Many of these 17th century cottages were used to conceal contraband, such as alcohol and tobacco. Smuggling was rife in Cadgwith until a customs house and lockup were built. In 1816, 4 local men were caught smuggling contraband brandy, and they were press-ganged into the Royal Navy, serving at the blockade of Algiers. Revenue men were then billeted in the village. Many communities around Cornwall are still characterised by their fishing, shipbuilding and smuggling industries. Maritime trade has generated a unique society that celebrates this today with songs, poetry and Cornish verse.
My name was Captain Kidd, and God's laws I did forbid. So wickedly I did as I sailed, so wickedly I did as I sailed. I murdered William Moore as I sailed, I murdered William Moore as I sailed. I murdered William Moore and I laid him in his gore, not many miles from shore as I sailed, not many miles from shore as I sailed. I spied 3 ships from Spain as I sailed, I spied 3 ships from Spain as I sailed.